Hi, everyone. All right, I think we're going to get started. It is so nice to see so many of you here from all over the country and international. Those who are Addison regulars, those who are maybe soon to be Addison regulars. My name is Jamie Kaplowitz Gibbons. I'm the head of education at the Addison Gallery of American Art, and I have the pleasure of working with a fantastic team of colleagues. While I wish we could be welcoming you at the museum itself today, we are lucky to have the resource of this 3D tour that we'll be using shortly. It was created back in February by Dongchang Han, who's a Phillips Academy student, class of 2023. For those who haven't visited the museum yet, a little bit of background. The Addison Gallery of American Art is on the campus of Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, and our collection of American art is one of the most comprehensive in the world, including more than 23,000 objects spanning 18th century through the present. In a typical year, the Addison presents approximately 12 exhibitions, including both exhibitions of work in our permanent collection and major traveling shows. The exhibition that we'll be exploring today, while comprised mostly of permanent collection, is not a permanent exhibition. Everything rotates multiple times per year. We are open to the public, and there is never an admission charge to visit or for any programming, and we look forward to welcoming you once it's safe to do so. A couple quick housekeeping items before we begin our tour. This is an experiment, and we are excited to have you all here live on Zoom to help us see if it works. And if it does, we look forward to using this format again in the future. The tour is being recorded so that if you miss part of it or you have to leave early, you can catch up, or for those who can't join us so that they can watch again later. So that little red light in the corner of your screen means that this is being recorded. It does not mean that anyone can see or hear you, just me at the moment, which is slightly nerve-wracking. The tour will run about 40 minutes, and at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. We plan to use some time at the end of the tour to answer a few questions. So please submit any questions that come up for you throughout the tour. We may not get to all of them, but I will summarize as many as we have time for. So in a moment, I will turn you all over to Gordon Wilkins, who is the Robert M. Walker Associate Curator of American Art at the Addison. Gordon has also regularly been posting on the Addison's social media accounts. So if you have been following us on Instagram, now you can put a face to the voice. Gordon is going to share his screen and use the virtual tour that I mentioned to lead you all through the exhibition, A Wildness Distant from Ourselves, Art and Ecology in 19th Century America, which opened at the Addison back in September. Okay, Gordon, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll see if this works, first of all. And then if it does, we'll be able to go through. Okay, it seems like it works. So thank you so much to Jamie for the wonderful introduction, and thank you as well for to Kevin Cordy, who is helping us behind the scenes through the Academy's IT office. So here we are right now in the atrium of or the rotunda rather, of the Addison Gallery of American Art. And I'm hopeful that many of you are familiar with this vista. It's quite a beautiful sight to see walking right in the doors, which are behind me, and seeing our beautiful Paul Manship fountain dead ahead. And the exhibition, A Wildness Distant from Ourselves, Art and Ecology in 19th Century America, begins right here in the rotunda. And again, as Jamie mentioned, this is certainly an imperfect content delivery method. The tour is not exactly high res, so we won't be able to do as many close-looking, deep dive, get right in front of the painting, look at minute details kinds of activities as we would if we were all in person. But it will give, I hope, a pretty good sense of the themes of the exhibition, the themes that I hope to explore through this exhibition. And then we'll also be able to stop and look more deeply at certain larger scale works. There are also weird sort of oddities that go along with this. So at some point you may see someone's foot, you may see one of our security guards. Just be aware that this is far from perfect, but we're doing our best. So back to the show. So the exhibition came out of a partnership that was forged between the Addison and the Andover Village Improvement Society. And I hope some of the trustees and members of AVIS, which is what it's called, are in the audience today. They approached our director, former director, Judith Dolkart, before I was even hired, to do some sort of a show that would celebrate the Andover Village Improvement Society's 125th anniversary, which was last year in 2019. And they are the second oldest conservation organization in the United States. So it was quite a momentous occasion. And they wanted to see if the Addison could do something to mark that occasion. So when I came on board in October of 2018, this idea for a show was sort of given to me, which is not always how curators like to do things. I think we like to think that we are all coming up with these amazing original ideas that have no outside influence. But this was one of the great opportunities, early opportunities, because I had sort of a general idea of what I wanted to do, but I was kind of allowed to do whatever I wanted to do within this general landscape, ecology kind of theme, overarching theme. And it was a great way to learn the collection. And as we walk through, I'll point out there are a few works in the show that are not from the Addison's collection, but the vast majority of works in the show are from the Addison's collection. And out of that high percentage of works from the Addison collection, about half or maybe even to 2/3 of the works on view haven't been shown either ever in the history of their being in the Addison's collection, or haven't been shown in decades. So it was a really exciting opportunity to revisit some of the old favorites, but then also get some new stuff, and then also some old stuff that is new to most visitors because it hasn't been on view before. So I will not read my large text panel over here, but I selected objects in this rotunda, and there are 3 objects. There's this model from the 1930s of the Mayflower, which we're celebrating the 400th anniversary this year of the landing of the Pilgrims in Plymouth. We also have this great 18th century large format map of New England. And then you can see the beautiful February weather outside. And then we have Augustus Saint-Gaudens, the Puritan, which is a work that dates to 1899 and was cast later. But the reason why I have these 3 objects, all from different time periods, is that they speak to a certain sense of deep time, thinking about the time before colonization, before European American intervention in the natural world of North America. And they also speak to the ways in which complex ideologies can be embedded within works of art. And that's something that I wanted to get across in this exhibition. I wanted people to first, when they walked in, looked at these works, read the labels, realize that the history of the land that we're on is not a 400-year history. It's a multiple millennia history. And that we, as I'm speaking, of course, about the royal we of myself as a descendant of European American colonizers, settlers, to use the more romantic term, that this is, that we have been sort of inculcated in this history where we think that our history is clearly bounded between 1620 and 2020. But in fact, our history dates back thousands of years. The history of intervention of people living on this land dates back thousands of years before European Americans first stepped foot on its shores. So that was a major point that I wanted to get across. We'll also see throughout the exhibition the ways in which works by Indigenous American makers have been integrated into the exhibition. And I'll also talk a little bit about the frameworks that I embedded those works in. So for the kind of deep dive in this first space, and unfortunately, this is about as close as I can get. I can zoom in a little bit, but I've tried to sort of shift the angle so that we're dead on, but it ends up taking us into the conference room, which is not where we want to be. But we're going to look just for a moment at this image of the Puritan. And I should also add that the entire checklist for this exhibition is available on our website, Allison. I'm thinking of our director, Allison, at all times. addisongallery.org, and you can click on our collections page and find a checklist for this exhibition. So if you want to see something in greater detail, I urge you to go on to the website and check it out after. So this is the Puritan. This was sculpted by Augustus Saint-Gaudens, who is an immigrant to the United States. And he was inherently critical and I think quite suspicious of the American mythology around the founding of what we now know of as the United States. He was actually commissioned by the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, to create a large-scale public sculpture, and that public sculpture still stands, called the Puritan. And then he also made a smaller edition of the work. And the Addison is fortunate enough to own perhaps the finest cast of this work in a public collection in the United States. So it's a beautiful piece, but it's a very disturbing piece when you focus really on the details. You can't, of course, you can't see the expression of the man's face, but I'll just describe it. He's a very austere fellow. You can see that he's clad in the kind of romanticized 17th century Puritan garb with the buckle hat and the shoes and the waistcoat, and he has a very large cloak that sort of turns him into this spectral presence, sort of as if he's haunting the land. He's carrying a walking stick in one hand, and then a large book, which, considering the sort of dogma attached with the founding of the United States, it's most likely the Bible. And then his eyes are cast downward, sort of not particularly engaged with his surroundings, but just kind of looking directly in front of himself. And he's trampling on this, you obviously can't see, but it's this branch, and it's a juvenile pine tree. And I think Augustus Saint-Gaudens, who was critical of the founding and of the ways in which European Americans took over, usurped the land from indigenous peoples, and radically transformed the land, you can see this as kind of an indictment of Puritans, of the quote, founders of the United States, with this man striding across the landscape, not really paying attention to where he's going, breaking the natural flora represented by this pine tree, but you can extend that to all of the quote unquote indigenous things about North America. So it's this, I think, quite strong indictment of Puritans and this sort of puritanical worldview that I'll show through this exhibition has really inspired the way in which we have considered the natural world from the 17th century to the present. And of course, now I'm going and backflipping back to the beginning, but I should mention that the title derives from, I'm not brilliant enough to come up with that title. I stole it from Thoreau, and I think that's a pretty decent source to steal anything having to do with ecology. He wrote, "It is in vain to think of a wildness distant from ourselves. There is none such." And I wanted that quote, which became the title, to really introduce the show and one of the main themes of the show, which is that there is no discrete barrier between man and nature. This show is complicated, it's messy, it really resides in the gray areas that exist between what we perceive as opposing sides. So it's really about how we are all interconnected. We are all inextricably linked to nature. There is no man separate from nature. And I think that that reality is becoming more and more stark, particularly in our current pandemic, where we realize anyone who thought that we weren't all connected has undergone a pretty rude awakening. So we'll now proceed into the first gallery. And I'll also mention that this show unfolds vaguely chronologically and then also geographically. So we're starting off in the first gallery in the rotunda with the 17th century, and now we're moving into the 18th and early 19th century, and we're following the path of the European American colonization of North America, starting in the Northeast, and then we expand outward. So we're right now here in New England with the works on view in this gallery. I'll actually start dead ahead with this remarkable large format painting called He That by the Plow Would Thrive, Himself Must Either Hold or Drive. And it's an unattributed work, probably dating to the mid-19th century, perhaps made in the mid-Atlantic. It's a work that has not ever been firmly attributed, and there's certainly a lot more work to be done about the work. But it's a fascinating, I think, tangible symbol of a particular worldview that has informed American history and culture. And that is the notion that nature is a wild sort of domain of Satan, and that in order to eke out a living, in order to make a life in this new world, that satanic, demonic wilderness had to be tamed. And you can see just how violent that taming was. What I like to do when I'm giving an in-person tour, and I think this translates as well to this virtual tour, is to ask people who are with me to envision this painting as if it were folded in half. So you can take your hand and put your hand over the left side of the painting. And if we're just looking at the right side of the painting, it looks like a beautiful, bucolic kind of pastoral scene. You have a young girl feeding it what appears to be a sheep. You have a milkmaid milking a cow. You have a young man and a team of oxen. You have a small farmhouse. You get a sense of this sort of romantic image of pioneers forging a life for themselves in America. So then pretend you hadn't seen that, flip it over, and look on the left-hand side. And you see this almost apocalyptic scene of slash and burn agricultural practices being utilized, of this deep gash in the earth, and that's left by this man pulling this hoe this plow, rather, pushing this plow in front of him. And these bonfires of debris, it looks as if a bomb had been dropped in the middle of this scene. You also see the remnants of clear cutting, the stumps that are these kind of almost tombstone-like reminders of what has been lost and what has been cut down and cleared in order to make room for agriculture. And agriculture was the true sign of progress in the minds of colonial settlers. And well into the 19th century, if you could transform the barren wilderness into agricultural land, you had done your Christian duty. So you kind of get this sense of unease in this painting, and you start to notice details like the trees don't have foliage on them, particularly this one. They kind of look like gnarled, atrophied hands reaching out, kind of caressing the sky. And then you also look, you look more closely, again, this is very imperfect. You look more closely at this tree and you notice that there's a vine that's kind of like a snake curling, roping itself around this tree, this dead tree. And to extend the religious metaphors that we've been working with, to think about the New World as an Eden, which it was perceived, the city on the hill, this desire to create a heaven on earth. The Garden of Eden, of course, was corrupted by the devil, and you have the story of Adam and Eve and the snake, and thinking about this kind of snake-like form of the vine choking this tree. And it speaks to the fact, and this is, it should mention also that this amazing line, "He that by the plow would thrive," derives from Benjamin Franklin, one of his maxims, urging young men and women to be constant workers and to never rest and always be diligent in their labor, and that labor is a godly act. But you start to see this as sort of this kind of a warning, a tale of warning, where if you're not diligent, if you're not always beating back the influence of Satan, represented by this vine, you risk absolute ruin. So That work is just so full of meaning that I really wanted it to be the first thing that a viewer encounters when they enter this gallery. And then turning around here to this side wall, there are a number of works that kind of extol the virtue of European American colonization of the wilderness. And one of the most emblematic works is this very unusual, again, mid-19th century, unidentified work by likely an itinerant artist in New England. And it's of an unknown family, bourgeois, upwardly mobile family sitting in their parlor. What I love about this painting is that there are so many references to the virtue of the domestic sphere, and then also to the celebration of this sort of tamed nature. First of all, dead center in the painting, you have this portal, and I think it could be read as a painting, this white frame containing a painting, or it could be a window. So it's this kind of illusionistic space, and you have this depth of field that extends beyond the painting. So it leads you back into space. But it's also, if you think about the idea of framing, either through a literal picture frame or by a window, you're containing something. You're controlling the way in which someone perceives something. In this case, either if it's a painting, or the artist has given you a very discrete, fixed image of this landscape, which is this, again, bucolic landscape of man kind of in an Arcadian state, coexisting with nature, but harnessing the power of nature. There's a mill in this painting, for example. So you have that as a really strong image of extolling the virtue of European American domination in the natural world. But then you also have other clues. You have a domesticated cat sitting under the father's chair, and then you have the young girl holding a basket of domesticated flowers. So it's really a kind of an ode to the power of the natural world, but really a natural world that is accessible, that's held at arm's length, that's sort of separate from the domestic, controlled, rational sphere. Really, the entire kind of American experience throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century was about taming the wildness, rationalizing the irrational. The nature was perceived as irrational and something to be harnessed. So this is a painting that really extols that virtue. And we have other examples of that same impulse in other works, including this painting by Thomas Sully that's almost impossible to see, and I won't try to zoom in because I made that mistake earlier, but you can see this young man. Actually, I might be able to zoom in a bit. Here we go. You see this young man, this kind of smartly attired man who's named Tom Wharton, who is part of a Philadelphia landowning family. There are multiple planes in this picture. So he's in the foreground, and then you see in the background this kind of brooding, stormy sky, and then two small farmhouses. These kinds of, they look like the only outposts of civilization in this vast frontier. But you'll notice that he is not in this wilderness. He is behind a Greek column, and there's a railing that extends. So he is very clearly kept apart or separate from nature. He's within the realm of the natural world. You see the allusion to antiquity here, seeing this kind of American civilization, this advanced American civilization growing out of the wilderness. And those are ideas that would be explored in Hudson River School paintings, of which we have a few examples on this wall as well. This small Frederick Church study here of Mount Katahdin being a really prime and beautiful example that I urge you to look at in greater depth and detail. Oh, and there's the founder of our feast, so to speak, Dong Chang, working on making goal. So let's see if we can, yeah, there we go. So I also, in this section, and the show again is very broad and complicated, and it really deliberately eschews adopting one narrative. And I made the very deliberate choice as well to sign or to put my name after the text, because I wanted to make it clear that this is a point of view that's filtered through multiple layers of experience. I'm using our collection in this show, but you have to think back about who was buying work for this collection, what were their tastes, who was not involved in that decision. And then today, how are we collecting currently? There are so many larger issues. So I wanted to make it clear that we are not endeavoring to tell a comprehensive story, if one can even be told, which I don't think one can. But it's coming from a very particular point of view, and just to make that as transparent as possible is really powerful. That the work on view in these galleries, most of which came in the first kind of 20, 30 years of the Addison's existence, were acquired by people of a certain race, of a certain status, and were created by people, mostly men, who were almost exclusively white and almost exclusively middle class or upper middle. So realizing the inherent biases embedded within our collections and then working to move beyond that, but really to lay that bare and to make that transparent was very important to me. So I also explore in this gallery the rise of tourism and land-based tourism, which we sort of take for granted today, that Niagara Falls is a major tourist destination, but it wasn't always the case. So we start here with these two watercolors on the right-hand side of the doorway by the artist Dunlap, who is perceived as the founder of American art history, because he wrote a series of biographies of the leading artists, American artists of his time. And he was also an artist himself and created a series of watercolors. The Addison has about a dozen of these amazing early 19th century watercolors of Niagara Falls, and these date to 1815. And again, doesn't do it justice. But what was interesting in doing some research about this artist is that he was already starting to see how the ways of depicting Niagara Falls had already by the early 19th century become somewhat standardized and kind of trite. Niagara Falls scene is, of course, to begin with, a very special and sacred place for Indigenous peoples of that region. It's also was a very sacred place for Americans. In the 19th century, it was hard to access. So really only those of certain means could afford to visit Niagara Falls. There is a great story of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the American author, sort of falling to his knees because when he foresaw the great sublime beauty of Niagara Falls in front of him. And so think about that in the sort of early 19th century, to Oscar Wilde making the comment later in that century that the first of many great disappointments in a young American bride's life was to honeymoon at Niagara Falls. And that was because by the time that Oscar Wilde was writing about Niagara Falls, it had become a tourist trap. And so land very early on was seen as something that could be exploited for entertainment. Here we have two popular images from Harper's Magazine. And the top, it depicts a well-attired white bourgeois couple visiting in the late 19th century, visiting Niagara Falls, trading with Indigenous peoples. And the sort of interaction with Indigenous peoples at Niagara Falls became in and of itself a tourist attraction. And only certain members of the various Native groups in the area were allowed to set up trading posts in the region. And part of the many experiences that one would undergo or enjoy when one visited Niagara Falls would be to interact with Native Americans. It was this sort of sick precursor to almost like a human zoo. But again, since the show looks at these gray areas and these very complicated, complex points of exchange and prolonged exchange, it should also be recognized that this interaction with between Indigenous people and European American visitors also helped to ensure the survival of indigenous crafts, and was really the only source of economic possibility for many indigenous people. So we have examples of those, of works that were produced for a tourist trade in this vitrine. We have a beautiful beaded headband here that has the initials NY in the center with these stylized American flags. And then you also have this beautiful moose hair embroidered basket that has the depiction of European American smoking pipes. So you have this, we think about moments, kind of discrete moments of exchange, but wanting visitors to think about, you know, I heard this great quote from a colleague that we like to think about sort of Native peoples in one kind of box and white people in another, but they were all living amongst each other. There was no really other. Everyone was together and interacting and interfacing. We're not talking about discrete moments of exchange, but talking about prolonged periods of intermingling and the crossing transmission of ideas. And of course, this was all rooted in genocide and forced removal, but there are these complicated, these complex stories that are also there that need to be told. And then finally in this gallery, I wanted to talk about the birth of landscape tourism in New England with the rise of White Mountains-based tourism. And what a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know before I started working on this show, is that the sort of power, the romantic, sublime power of nature, which is very much embedded in the power of nature to destroy and the sort of inability to tame the wildness, that a story tied that's really saturated in those themes inspired tourism to kind of inspired what we consider to be landscape tourism in New England. And that all dates back to the 1820s with the Willie House disaster. And the Willie House, and we have a stereo card here that depicts the house. Of course, you can't see it, but there was a family, a fairly large family that lived in this house that was adjacent to one of the many peaks that comprise the White Mountains. And the family was very afraid of avalanches occurring and wiping the entire house out. So they actually built an outbuilding that they believed would withstand an avalanche and that they could get to quickly. And of course, there's not much lead time before disaster strikes in that situation. So I believe it was August and there was already snow. And the family awoke to this horrible noise and knew that an avalanche was coming, and they ran out. The next day, neighbors, didn't have neighbors for miles, but neighbors came to check on the family knowing that they lived in a remote area, and were kind of shocked to discover the house was totally empty, but standing. It did not appear as if any damage had occurred to the house. And the family was nowhere to be found inside the house. And it was discovered that the family had all perished in the snow, that as they left the house for thinking that they were going to safety, they were actually overtaken by the snow, by the avalanche, and all of the members of the family died. And that sort of, the kind of Gothic almost story inspired people to come and visit the house, which had been spared because through an act of God or fate, the avalanche split in two, and like a river wrapped around the sides, like a river around an island wrapped around the sides of the house. And if they had stayed in the house, they would have been spared. So that inspired people, as disturbing as it is, although we still visit sites associated with murder or sites associated with hauntings. Early 19th century Americans flocked to the White Mountains to see this unbridled power of nature. And it was very disappointing to Winslow Homer, who visited in the 1860s and has represented and we have a work here from that dates back to that time. He was really disappointed. He thought he was going to go to this kind of unspoiled, wild place, but he saw all of these Bostonians riding side saddle in their full petticoats up the mountain, and he was quite dismayed. So again, looking at the ways in which landscape is celebrated and corrupted. So we'll continue on into the next gallery, and sorry for that rapid transition. We're now expanding our view, and we're moving forward in time. We're now in the 19th century firmly. And the United States is in a period of rapid expansion. There's a perception amongst people in the United States, particularly those living in the Northeast, that they were running out of land, that the world around them was shrinking, and that they were becoming more and more confined and did not have the sort of ability to expand, to acquire more land in the quantities that people wanted. And of course, this is a largely agricultural society at that time, and in order for agriculture to thrive, you need land. So with the Louisiana Purchase, which vastly increased the size of the United States, there was a massive migration across the United States into the inner parts of the country as people began to leave the Northeast and literally sprint across the plains over the Appalachian Mountains, which the Appalachian Mountains sort of were the boundaries of America up until that point, or Northeastern America. They went off and just usurped land left and right, of course, displacing many, many indigenous peoples who had occupied the land for thousands of years. Along with that came the rise throughout the 19th century of industry. And this show takes place in a museum located in Andover, which was a major industrial capital, and close to an even more significant industrial capital, Lawrence, Massachusetts. And thinking about the ways in which industry impacted the land, and thinking about how industry impacted ecology. And ecology is really all about the intersection, the intermingling of various entities within the natural world. But if you think about a human ecology as well, how people live and how they interact with each other, history radically changed human ecology as well. So starting off with this view of the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, which dates to the 1850s. And what's fascinating about this is that you can make out next to the title there are two columns. So on one hand, on one side of this hand-colored lithograph, there's a list of all of the churches. So we think about religion in the first gallery as being kind of the prime motivator behind this desire to control and contain the land. Here, you have that on one side, but on the other side, and actually in greater detail, you have a list of factories, and you have the number of people employed and their output. So you see that industry and God are held sort of at the same level in this particular work, which reflects a much broader worldview. You know, God was replaced by mammon. You have this desire to accumulate capital, to transform raw materials into finished goods for trade, and the Merrimack Valley of Massachusetts was really one of the epicenters of that. We have Lowell, Lawrence, Andover also had mills, and these were largely immigrant communities that sprung up around these mills. Lawrence was a planned community built to sustain industry, not to sustain the well-being of its citizens, and so people lived in pretty miserable conditions for many years. So this is a glimpse at how industry was changing the landscape quite literally. You have a tree here, but the other large verticals in this scene are the smokestacks. You see smokestacks radically altering the landscape. This is an image of Andover. You can also see the plumes of smoke. Of course, these were seen as signs of progress, but you also have to think about how that progress came with really disastrous impacts on the environment. So we'll move along to this great painting by Charles Schuyler, who was the first artist in residence at the Addison Gallery of American Art and was invited by then director Bartlett Hayes to visit in the early 1940s. And he came to campus, and he was not required, as we require our artists in residence to do today, to interact with anyone, to make work, etc. he stayed with his dog at the Andover Inn and took pictures. He didn't paint, but he took the photographs that he was inspired to create and brought them back to his studio and executed a series of works inspired by his visit. And this is a great side-by-side because you have the mill complex in Andover that inspired this work. And he, of course, this kind of definitely falls outside of the timeline that we're getting at, but he was really kind of attuned to or aware of the struggles of a post-industrial society. By the 1940s, industry had for the most part left Andover and was starting to decline in Lowell and Lawrence as cheaper options, cheaper labor in the South became more readily accessible. But you were left with these massive structures, and he describes them as these old carcasses that dotted the landscape. And you have him depicting this old carcass here. It's called Ballard Vale, which is a region in Andover. And we're still living with the very tangible remains of unchecked industry. We're still dealing with long-standing impacts of industrial pollution, of these massive structures that were built and are no longer used for industry. Of course, not every factory building can be turned into a condominium complex. So the question of what do you do with this legacy, I think, is as keenly felt, if not more so today, than it was when Schuyler was working at Andover. So we'll step back and look at this wall. The sort of one of the major events, of course, of the 19th century in America was the Civil War. And we think about the loss of life when we think about Civil War more than sort of any other factor. But a new school of thought has been developing around the ecological impact of the Civil War. So in this section of the exhibition, I really wanted to look at the Civil War as an environmental catastrophe, which it was. And there's a lot of great new scholarship, and scholars have actually estimated that 400,000 acres of forest had to be cleared each year to sustain the demand for firewood, and just firewood for the Union and Confederate forces. So thinking about the vast quantities of natural resources that had to be expended in order to sustain the war effort, it's quite shocking. And this great Edward Lansing Henry painting here of City Point in Virginia that shows the hustle and bustle of a Union supply depot. And you have all modes of transportation converging here. And of course, transportation is a major factor that led to, or catalyst for, the expansion of the United States as we know it today. You have every conceivable mode of transportation converging in this one picture. You have boats, those that are powered by sails, also steam-powered boats. You have the railroad, you have wagon trains, you have people walking, people on horseback. And you also see that they've set up this camp atop of a bluff that's eroding. You see that they've clear-cut certain areas. So it's this scene that was actually inspired by the artist's first-hand encounter with City Point. He was, during the Civil War, aboard one of the vessels docked off the coast. And he worked for many years on this painting. And dead center, you have the American flag, which of course you can sort of make out here. And this painting was started during the Civil War, but finished right after the Civil War. And in many ways, this artist is looking at the power of unity and the power of this supply chain. Of course, everything becomes more and more relevant. Everything from the past kind of reappears. The power of the supply chain that the Union government was able to mobilize, create this vast network of supplies, distribute the supplies in a very efficient and effective way, and win the war. So he's making a case for this kind of unity. The nation was still deeply scarred and fractured at the end of the Civil War, and is still in many ways today. But you have this very potent symbol of America in the center. I think the artist is in many ways urging people to come together and to follow the lead of what he's depicting in this painting. And also the landscape became a really powerful tool for expressing emotion and for expressing anxiety. You see a lot of paintings before and after the Civil War that deal with similar themes. You have before the Civil War, the kind of efflorescence of the subject matter dealing with storms, of coming storms, things on the horizon. Of course, you know, there are all of these kind of foreboding omens that were associated with the onset of the Civil War, and people were anxious, stressed, and that it comes across very clearly in paintings. In this case, we have a Wyant painting that dates to just after the Civil War. And while we can't make it out quite, it's definitely not crystal clear here, you can kind of see in the lower left corner, there's this stump with all these gnarled roots. And it's a tree that's been cut in half, and you sort of see the side of the tree, the top part of the tree is kind of leaning over, connected by, looks like, you know, a little sinuous thread to the rest of the tree. So America had really been cut in half, quite literally, and the artist is expressing those, embedding those emotions, that anxiety for the future, in the landscape of Mount Equinox in this case. So on this wall, we have sort of an ode to transportation, and how transportation and technologies around transportation radically altered the way of life in America. So you have a map here that depicts the railway lines. So the railroad connected people in ways that were otherwise impossible. You also see the development of steamships and the digging of canals, and throughout the early 19th century into the mid-century, as people began to be able to more readily access the interior of the country. You have people going into the interior for resource extraction and then using this transportation network to ship the goods that they were creating, the raw materials, into the urban areas of America. So you see the rise of transportation as being key to the continued growth of the United States. And of course, with the rise of transportation, you also have the associated concerns around the treatment of indigenous peoples. And here we have a really beautiful Inman painting that we borrowed from our friends at the Peabody Academy, the Peabody Institute, right across the street. The Peabody has a quite remarkable collection of indigenous American works of art. And this is a painting after an original painting that unfortunately was lost in a fire at the Smithsonian, but it depicts Pelisharo, who was a member of a Great Plains tribe. And you see that he's wearing this medal, which actually has the image of Monroe, President Monroe on it. And it's a Indian Peace Medal, as they were called. And he was quite famous for a variety of reasons. He was a Pawnee chief. He was known for rescuing a Comanche maiden as she was about to be executed by his tribe. And that kind of took off. Of course, you can imagine how white readers of popular literature were titillated by that story. But he was also, perhaps more importantly, I'd say definitely more importantly, known for his advocacy for his tribe and their sovereignty and land rights. And he very passionately argued in front of President Monroe and in front of Congress for Congress to recognize the sovereignty of his tribe's ancestors, of his tribe, and also their right to control and govern their own land. Of course, that struggle for tribal sovereignty and for the government's respect of tribal land rights is ongoing. And in fact, a battle is currently taking place in Massachusetts with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and their land is under threat of being removed from them by the Department of the Interior. So these issues are not past. They are not in the past. They are very much of the present. So I urge you to continue to reflect about indigenous land rights in our current era, and not to think of them as something that was worried about in the 19th century. And I should just mention, for American art history freaks out there, there's a very famous painting by Samuel F.B. Morse of the U.S. Congress, and there's an indigenous man in the audience, and that indigenous man was Petalus Sharo. So we're going to move to the other half of the exhibition, and we'll cross again across the rotunda. You can see Joe, one of our security guards. We'll keep moving. We'll keep moving. And we'll start right here. I really wanted people to see this painting right as they entered this space. So there's as I mentioned, the show unfolds chronologically and geographically, and I wanted people to follow a pretty prescribed route. So we are following that route, and you'll have gone through what we went through to then come across this painting. So we've gone through this narrative of expansion, of anxiety around kind of the closing in of America, and then the remedies that the government put in place to assuage the population. That was through land grabs like the Louisiana Purchase. And then you also see throughout the mid-19th century the development of what we would consider, what we would say is manifest destiny. This painting by Alvin Fisher actually predates the coining of the term manifest destiny, which was coined by William Gilpin on the Senate floor. But it is really one of the most, I think, potent visual representations of that concept. And of course, the manifest destiny is the notion that God had ordained the United States to take over from east to west the entirety of the land, that the United States was meant to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that it was God's will. And so if you can justify anything, you can really justify anything by saying it's God's will. And it became a very convenient excuse among generations of Americans. But this painting really speaks to that. And is also part of a whole kind of visual propaganda around the meant to entice people to move west and to promote the West. Of course, this is not a government sanctioned form of propaganda, but it's very much still propaganda. You see in the foreground this pathway that cuts through the wilderness. You have a wagon train. Sort of, you can almost imagine these people embarking on this journey west, and you can kind of, particularly those of us who were raised on the computer game Oregon Trail, you can kind of imagine the experience. But you, of course, are reminded also, because there's an inclusion of this small detail here of a tombstone, that this was a treacherous journey that really only the hardy and the brave could undertake. And they were venturing toward this heaven, almost heaven on earth. You have this, I made a joke, I accidentally said corona, which is halo, a synonym for halo, when I talked about this painting in a video that I made, but I of course just repeated that mistake, but I won't dwell on the fact that I used the word corona. But there's a halo of light that is bathing the Rocky Mountains, and it's Wagon Train in the Rocky Mountains is the title. It's bathing the Rocky Mountains in this heavenly glow. So you can imagine this impulse that was felt to move west, and how imagery like this, and also like Albert Bierstadt, which we're not going to be able to see well, this small picture that I really urge you to go on to our website and look at and to zoom in on, also contributed to this conception of the land of the West as boundless, and also just sort of there for, just waiting almost for European American conquest, almost as though you could just walk right in and the deer would greet you, and all of the woodland animals would help you build your house. You see in this picture, I say you see, but you can't really see. It's a virgin landscape. It's also a landscape without people. And the erasure of indigenous people in these landscapes was also really key to the promotion of the West. There was a lot of anxiety around indigenous peoples. There was a lot of fear of indigenous retribution, of losing one's life at the hands of indigenous peoples. And these images helped to calm people down, to assure the European Americans who wanted to embark on a journey west, that there was nothing to worry about. Of course, that wasn't true, but Bierstock contributed to this sort of propaganda campaign. And he also emphasized elements of the composition in order to heighten this sort of sublime power of mountains of the West and the scale of the West, which was really key to conveying the vastness and kind of boundlessness of the West. The West became far more easy to traverse as the expansion of the railway across the United States developed, ending in 1869 with the Golden Spike at Count Bluffs, Iowa. You have the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which continued throughout the Civil War. It's incredible that such a major public works project or infrastructure project continued during the Civil War. You have the Transcontinental Railroad that was inspired in large part by the discovery of gold in California in the 1840s and the vast increase of populations migrating across the West. The Transcontinental Railroad, since we're looking at many things through an ecological framework in this exhibition, was also a tremendous ecological disaster. It disrupted really almost every aspect of the ecology of the Great Plains in the West. You have the quite literal construction of a barrier. The tracks, that is a very, oftentimes tracks were laid through massive uses of dynamite. So the blasting, you have you have erosion, you have people removing, displacing large quantities of earth and leaving these tunnels and bridges and in their wake. But again, thinking about this narrative, it's also it also facilitated, of course, the continued displacement and genocide of indigenous peoples. This is a fascinating work of art that has very rarely been shown. And it's actually based off of a French print, which again speaks to just how interconnected we've been for many, many years. And it's called Anti-Railroad Days, which I love as a title. You have that written on this stagecoach, and you have, it's certainly not a work by a professional artist, but someone who had a pretty keen sense of imagination. You have this stagecoach here, which of course is a very strong, potent representation of the sort of seemingly unstoppable advance of European Americans across the continent. And you have all of these white men crowding together, shooting at native peoples who are fighting back against their forced removal and the usurpation of their land. So you have, of course, the railroad as this symbol, this really tragic symbol. And then you also, again, looking at the complexities of this time, the railroad was also like it was very much like the tourism in Niagara Falls, was really the only line that many people, indigenous peoples, particularly in the Southwest, had, economic lifeline and lifeline connection to the outside world. And so it also facilitated the continued development and survival of indigenous crafts, because just like in Niagara Falls, having an interaction with an indigenous person was very much part of the experience of traveling across the country by train. So you have this amazing Tono Hodum, Arizona tribe basque that depicts a locomotive and train cars, not a traditional Native American motif. But you have mutual influence, these moments, these periods of exchange, of ideas, of aesthetics, and it's important to recognize that it's not black and white. It's not a binary. That there are these areas of complexity. The railroad dramatically altered the landscape of the West. You have many depictions of the railroad throughout 19th century American art. We also got ahead of ourselves here. That shows the limits of this of this corner here. But you see also I've integrated three-dimensional objects throughout, and we were very fortunate to be able to borrow really significant natural history specimens from both the Peabody Institute just across the street in Andover and the Academy of Natural Sciences, which is part of Drexel University in Philadelphia. And they very generously lent this incredible bison skull, which was actually collected by the famed Wild West superstar Buffalo Bill Cody. And you have next to it a spoon that was signed, a Lakota bison horn spoon that was signed by Sitting Bull, who was once employed by Buffalo Bill, is best known as a leader of his people against the imperialist forces of the United States. So you have these very powerful symbols of disparate worldviews that are put side by side. One, you have the bison here collected by Buffalo Bill, and of course embedded in this singular bison head or histories of the mass destruction of bison at the hands of the US government. The same people who during the Civil War orchestrated the policy of total war against the South, which was really an environmental policy in many ways. It was a policy of clear cutting, very deliberately destroying crops. You see General Sheridan, who was one of the originators of that theory and practice during the Civil War, being brought on to fight indigenous peoples in the West. And he knew that if you attacked the keystone species or the kind of keystone entity that sustained the lives of Native peoples, which was the bison, which had been very sustainably harvested and hunted for millennia, if you eradicated your enemy's source of food, of clothing, shelter, etc., you could eradicate your enemy. And so the US Army hired people like Buffalo Bill, and also the railroad companies, which we mentioned, also hired people like Buffalo Bill to shoot bison indiscriminately. And there are actually images like the one on this wall of train cars going by and people shooting bison from train cars. So you have this amazing history embedded in this single object. And it also is a purely decorative object. This is meant as a trophy. Whereas next to it you have, and of course it's sort of trite to think about indigenous peoples. It's a very old school way of thinking that's certainly outdated, but is at its core, there's truth to it. You know, the whole idea of indigenous peoples utilizing every part of the buffalo. Not to put too fine a point on that, but this is really a demonstration of that, but much in a much larger sense of this idea of this knowledge, indigenous knowledge of the interconnectivity of the world. And that's something that we're kind of only catching on to, that we are all connected and that, you know, the extinction of one species has ramifications for all of us in some capacity, really. So you see here this spoon. You have the bison horn being used for durable goods in this case, and also you know, thinking about the exploitation of the aesthetics of indigenous peoples and of indigenous peoples themselves through entertainment, and how that continues to this day. And then in this corner, finally in this gallery, it's that's a bust. It's going to be hard to see, but we have sort of depictions of what I call, it's kind of a corner of little white people and big trees or big natural formations. So you have, this is an entire wall of little white people standing next to features that could be found in the West. And again, like the Alvin Fisher painting and like the Bierstadt painting, you see this development of a visual language of scale in the West, where, you know, the West was vast, of course, but it wasn't too vast. That, you know, you could still feel at home in the West, even though you were dwarfed by these massive formations. In the case of the central image, if you get close enough, and I urge you to go on the website, you see there's a little man standing next to it. Why would that happen? And it's to convey, of course, the scale and the boundlessness, but it's also to show that, you know, a man exist freely and not be at risk in this landscape. So it's, again, a way to comfort and promote the West as a place for continued American growth. So this is if anyone knows me, this is sort of like my own interior design aesthetic that I've kind of transposed onto the walls of the Addison, which is a very Victorian way of displaying things. I like a gallery wall. And I've replicated that. Of course, you can see dead ahead in this gallery. But thematically, we've gone to the west, of course, in this last area. And so we've kind of pushed as far as we can go. There's this kind of the frontiers endless that begins to erode in the 19th century, and European Americans realize that the United States is finite, that there's only so far that they can go, and there's this beginning of looking inward and a pretty disturbing realization that humans have radically transformed North America. That there was this anxiety being in the 19th century that species would be lost to time, and artists like John James Audubon, represented by this massive elephant folio. Of course, I can't get that close to it. Elephant folio of his 4-volume Birds of America, which were published in the 1820s into the 1830s. You have artists like Audubon who became obsessed with documenting the natural world, and you see that trickling through all aspects of visual culture, where you start to see things like in heavy Victorian furniture carved with fruit and fish and deer carcasses. There's this beginning of a realization of the richness of America, but continued realization, but then also that there's a birth of what we would kind of consider to be an environmental impulse, that that this was not last forever, and that it needed to be documented for posterity. So I start this gallery in this corner with this juxtaposition between this peel, sorry, yeah, not perfect. It was pretty good though, so let's see if I can get back to that spot. So we have this peel still life that's posed next to this vitrine that has this amazing beaded Anishinaabe bag. It was actually a gift of the Anishinaabe people to Warren Moorhead, who was a very key person in the Institute of Archaeology, and who advocated for the Anishinaabe people of the White Earth Reservation in, I believe, Minnesota, argued in front of Congress for their land rights, and argued for government intervention to stop timber companies from threatening the sovereignty of the tribe and their land. So I've juxtaposed two very seemingly disparate things, but if you look at the iconography, you'll notice that there are a lot of similarities. You have, in both cases, this representation of the bounty of America. In Peel's very traditional portrait, following in this great Vanitas Dutch still life tradition, you have bounty of America represented by many species of fruits that were in fact not indigenous to the United States. So you see, of course, getting into agriculture and the changing of the agricultural landscape. You have things that were imported, but you also have some indigenous fruits, but you have them, they're separated from their context. They've been cut, they're in a nondescript space that gives a sense of depth. They're lit very dramatically, but again, we don't know where the light is coming from. Could be coming from an artificial source. We don't know. This bag, which again, these are depicts fruit, but you have a vine, and you have this idea of connectivity, of things being linked together, that the leaves and the buds and the fruit and the flowers, these are all stages in a continuum of life that is interconnected with all that's around it, and it can't be separated, can't be decontextualized, placed on a shelf, analyzed with this cold scientific light. So I wanted people to sort of think critically about how still lifes, which we might think of as totally innocuous, perpetuate certain worldviews. in ways that can continue to be somewhat damaging. So you see the proliferation of the theme of the bounty, the cornucopia, continuing through. You have the development of a very rich culture around gardening. This is a really fantastic Mariah Oki doing painting, one of very few by the artist who, no offense to her husband, I think was a far more interesting painter than her husband was. But she was known for these very close-up, cropped, almost abstract depictions of flowers, all done from really the confines of her home garden. She was part of an art colony in New Hampshire with Saint-Gaudens and other leading artists of the time. But you have these amazing poppies, this really detailed focus, almost with a scientific accuracy. So you have people really looking closely. There's this close looking at the world, and that's exemplified not just by work of professional artists, but by, in this case, you see work by sort of amateur artists, including young girls. This theme of the kind of basket full of fruit was one that was copied over and over again, can be found in many different contexts. And is very key. That imagery is key to a lot of visual culture around young women in America. We have this beautiful, sensitive portrait of a squirrel that I just love, and this amazing Asher Durand landscape study where you can almost feel the kind of, you can almost feel, if you want to reach out and touch this painting, which I would advise against, but you feel like you can touch the moss. It's that rich and that powerful. I've also included these amazing taxidermy birds. And I realize now that, of course, I'm going over time. So I don't blame you if you've already left by now. I'm not paying attention to the visitor count, so I'm sorry. But you see these amazing birds. And these, it was really important for me to include natural history specimens in this show. And they serve as these very tangible kind of totems and have really powerful, people have actually described getting quite emotional, because you think about endangered and extinct species, and these are all extinct species, and you think about them usually through the lens of Audubon, his Birds of America, but to see them in the flesh, so to speak, is a completely different experience. So I wanted to include these in the company of works of art to get at the sort of physical reality of extinction. And we are confronted by that in this gallery, where we have Carolina parakeet here, the passenger pigeon, probably the most famous example of extinction in the passenger pigeons went extinct in the 19-teens, but their fate was sort of preordained almost in the 19th century. The ivory-billed woodpecker, people still have unverified sightings of that, but likely extinct. You have the great auk, which was prized for its eggs. It was also used for down in Europe, and then became extraordinarily popular because of its rarity. And people began to go to Iceland to hunt down the last remaining auks. And this auk is actually part of the Peabody. It's owned by Phillips Academy, and was collected by the founder, not directly collected, but purchased by the founder of the Addison, Thomas Cochrane, who paid about $30,000 in the 1930s for this one specimen. And to put that into context, he paid about $65,000 at about the same time for Winslow Homer's 8 bells. So in his mind, this was worth half of what Winslow Homer's 8 bells is worth. In 1930s dollars, it's over $500,000. So pretty remarkable to think, not that we tend to attach value, but thinking about just how important these and in demand these specimens were. You have the Labrador Duck, which is extraordinarily rare. It's actually, some biologists think of this as not actually a unique species. Audubon actually never encountered any of these Labrador ducks in person, because of course a lot of his practice was, came around his direct interaction with specimens, since he was so aware of historical accuracy, or not historical, scientific accuracy. He himself shot and killed thousands and thousands of birds. He would pose with wires and then draw them meticulously. The Labrador duck he was never able to get a hold of a specimen, a live specimen. So there are thoughts that perhaps the Labrador duck was a hybrid. But in any case, there are only 80 auks in the world, and there are only about 47 Labrador ducks. So certainly not as appealing looking. It's certainly seen better days, but very important specimen. And we have an original watercolor, one of two in our collection by Audubon. And then finally, just kind of taking a step back and looking at this massive gallery wall. And this wall addresses, we've looked at a lot of large-scale interventions in the natural world through things like the building of the railroad. There are examples of mining operations, timber operations. Here you have smaller scale interventions in the land that of course have a cumulative impact. I have depictions of trapping for fur here, including this beautiful beaver pelt hat. Here we have hunting, and how it pervaded various forms of visual culture. I wanted to show that, depictions of the hunt infiltrated many aspects of life, not just rarefied fine art. This is a picture with a hunting dog, and then dead animals that are hung up by their legs. You have other depictions of the hunt. This massive painting, this Hinckley, very typical Victorian sort of living room painting that we actually had conserved for this exhibition, because it was not an exhibition quality, but it's revealed to be this beautiful painting. A lot of people find it disturbing because of this dog. Let's just say that the dog is stunned. It's sleeping. It's not dead. But you have nature fighting back against these hunting dogs in this picture, which is why I chose it. Then you also have depictions of fishing. The land became, really part of the national identity, particularly the identity around men, and masculinity, which is a topic of another show that I have up at the Addison, was really wrapped up into man's dominion over nature. So you have representative examples of that throughout this exhibition, but really on this wall, including this fantastic watercolor of a dog on the log, one of our visitors' favorites. So with that, I know I've gone over time, so I will stop sharing my screen. Let's see if that works. And I will turn it over to Jamie if she has any questions.
Yeah, I think we probably have time to squeeze in one or two. So we have the question of, are there works that you wish you had the space to include in the exhibition that you had to omit?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I tend to overshop for exhibitions. We talk about that a lot at the Addison. We're both, all of the curators at the Addison are kind of guilty of this, because we have so much great stuff. Not to brag, but we have an amazing collection. And this show, there were a million different things that could have gone in this show that I had to exclude for a variety of reasons. Scale wasn't really one of them in terms of stuff from our collection, because what we have for the most part is appropriately scaled for our facility. I would have loved to have had a full-size bison mount in the rotunda, but you can't do anything with the Manship Venus fountain, obviously. So there's nowhere else that it could go. But there are a lot of things that I wish I could have included. Largely, what I didn't include were things that either were not of exhibition quality, things that needed a lot of conservation work, that couldn't be completed in time for the show, because I organized the show in about 6 months. So it was, which sounds like a long time, but for museum, that's like, being expected to put on a show tomorrow. And then also things that were redundant, I had a lot of duplication, and just making sure that I wanted to choose the best examples. And also light sensitivity. I built in rotation. So what you're seeing actually, since this virtual tour was made in February, this is the second iteration of the show with certain works, light sensitive works like watercolors that were switched out halfway through.
All right, and I think we can maybe squeeze in one more quick question. So we have a participant who wrote that they really appreciated the critique of the traditional settler colonial narrative throughout the exhibition, and they're curious about the works in the rotunda. That the rotunda kind of focuses on the Euro-American artworks that underscore the traditional narrative, and so they were wondering if you could talk about how you made those decisions.
So that opens up a big can of worms that we could spend hours talking about. I think, oh God. So going back to the founding of the Addison is a very unique institution. We're a museum of American art, but unlike the Whitney, for example, we are very much, it's a restriction, but I think it also leads to a lot of creativity. We're only allowed to acquire, we can show works by any culture, but we're only allowed to acquire for a permanent collection by US born artists and artists or naturalized US citizens. And so with that in mind, in the 1930s, people were collecting American works of art. And works by indigenous makers, that was not considered art at that time. For those people who did consider those works to be artworks or works worthy of display, it was in an ethnographic collection, not in a fine arts context like the Addison. So our collection excludes a large chunk of American visual culture, if we want to say American. And that's something that American art museums are really working to address and then to broaden the narrative. It's complicated, it's messy work. Clearly, I'm a white Anglo curator. As a white male Anglo curator, I recognize the limitations of my own identity and don't impose my own identity on the works of art or perspectives of other peoples. That being said, it was really important for me to include Native perspective in some way in this exhibition. I think that obviously I would have loved to have done more, but engagement, really powerful engagement with indigenous peoples and indigenous art takes time and expertise that I myself don't possess, and that requires really the development and the commitment, institutional commitment, to develop relationships with Native groups, and then to really think very critically about how indigenous art could find a place in this context. So what I chose to do was not to select works that were at all sensitive in the sense of ceremonial significance or religious significance. There's certainly no human remains on view. That can't be said for many institutions that are behind the times. But I was very aware of what could not be on view without really significant contextualization. But I did talk with colleagues, indigenous and non-indigenous colleagues, about what could be done in this show. And I selected works of tourist trade material, works that were produced for a Western audience. And I include, when I can in the labels, first person, if they're actually quite firmly attributed, because a lot of quotes that you have from Native American leaders were sort of either, were meant in many cases distillations by white people who kind of shifted the words to fit their purpose. So just being very careful and respectful and honest was important. But to not include something that of indigenous origin to kind of problematize the narrative was important. And I've been accused of being too critical in this show, of laying too much blame amongst white settlers. And that was not my goal. I think people can read into it as they will. I think that it's a very important narrative, and particularly as we were a teaching museum, it's a very important narrative for students to really, and I think it dovetails really beautifully with Andover's curriculum, that the story of America is not a cut and dry, easy story to tell. And this is not an easy exhibition. It's a challenging exhibition that's full of nuance and layers, many of which we can't access virtually, but I'm hoping a lot of you had a chance to see it since it has been up since September. But I don't think I answered the question, but those are just my crazed ramblings about Indigenous work in an American art historical context.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you. So I think we have to wrap up there. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to Gordon for sharing his phenomenal expertise with us.
I'll just quickly interject. If anyone has any questions, I have nothing to do but check email nowadays. So if you want to email me, I'm happy to field any requests or questions. My email is on the website, but it's just Wilkins, GWILKINS @andover.edu. Feel free to drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you. And I mean it. I'm not just saying it.
Thank you. And we also want to thank Kevin Cordy of Phillips Academy's Pope Lillard Center for his help in running this. If you jumped in late and you want to see the beginning, or if you know someone else who would enjoy watching, or if you want to watch again, we'll be sharing the recording on our website and via social media as soon as we can. For more information about the Addison, to keep up with all of our new initiatives, you should follow us on social media. You can also check out our website, which is addisongallery.org, and there you can sign up for our e-newsletters. And we can't wait to be able to welcome you all in person at the Addison when it's again safe to do so. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.